All right, when we tackle difficult problems, let's divide people into two types. Those who approach practice as inferior and those as superior. What does it mean to practice as an inferior? After finishing a problem, you see your poor performance, get angry, and after getting angry, you do another problem set, only to perform poorly again and get even more frustrated. This is called downloading and brushing questions. Why? He just wants to see the result he wants to hear in his heart. If he doesn't see the result he wants to hear, he will go and fight again. It's like what? You go to the temple to draw lots. If you draw the lot, you won't think about how to improve. You just want to say, then I will draw 3 times. Then you just look for 1. You already have the answer in your heart. You're just like others telling your answer, right? This is how people with an inferior mindset approach practice. Of course, those with an average mindset will actually reflect on the content of the problem and the wording. However, there's an issue with how many people in China practice. They don't try to synthesize or generalize. For example, when faced with this type of problem, what strategy should you use? In other words, what they learn today remains limited to this specific problem and doesn't carry over to the next one. So what does it mean to approach problems as a superior learner? The hallmark of a superior learner is that they don't just mindlessly do endless practice problems, nor do they only review the specific passage at hand. Instead, they take it a step further and reflect deeply. For example, if they encounter a difficult problem on the next exam, what characteristics might that challenging question have? How might those features present difficulties for me? And how can I address them? This is also why when I discuss these problems with you, you might notice that whereas before we could cover 2 passages at a time, now we focus on just 1 per session. The reason is that I want to incorporate more depth into my explanations. Very good. This way, you'll know exactly what key points to focus on when you encounter similar questions in the future. All right, so for today, once again, we'll probably only be able to cover 1 passage. My apologies for that. The reason is that this really isn't a medium difficulty question. When we return to medium difficulty questions in the future, we should be able to cover 2 passages at a time. But today's passage is particularly complex. All right, anyway, let's not waste any more time. Let's get started right away. Now, as you can see, this passage is a bit longer than usual. I believe that when you read the very first sentence, you probably felt that it wasn't very friendly, right? Well, what did he say? He said that in the late 19th century, the last quarter was the last 25 years of the 19th century. Well, it symbolizes a turning point. Well, this sentence is probably the only one you can understand in the whole article. Then he said something about type change. I said that biologists have become less interested in what things. There are relatively few people who apply an idea of historical explanation deductively to organic functioning. In other words, there are not many who take explanations from the field of history and try to apply them to biological structures or organic functions. This kind of approach has become less common, and people are less interested in it. I'm more interested in discerning the causes of vital processes through experimental manipulation. In other words, they are more interested in this kind of thing. They are interested in identifying, that is, the origins behind the mechanisms of life. And what method do they use to identify them? They are more interested in using experimental methods to do so. Okay, let's continue. Everyone, there are a few things in this sentence that you need to pay attention to. Of course, I believe you may encounter some difficulties when reading it. This does not refer to the first half of the sentence. The first half is absolutely straightforward. There are no complex modifiers. And the sentence structure is also very simple. You won't have any trouble with it. Everyone can read and understand it. It's simply called history at this point in time. We observe a transformation, right? If you do encounter any difficulty, it's probably in the latter half of the sentence. All right, now please pay attention to this half of the sentence. When you read it, you need to identify its logical focus. What do we mean by logical focus? Things like cause and effect, contrast, comparison, or transition, these are all logical focal points. It could also be about results, sequence, and so on. So what is the logical focus of this sentence? It's the less something, more something structure. In a long sentence, if you spot a parallel structure like this, that's the logical endpoint of the sentence. Okay, so there is less interest in certain things such as applying historical explanations to someone or something. There is more interest in applying them to the organic functions of biology. What are people interested in? They are more interested in using experimental methods to explore the origins of biology in this way. Now, regarding the sentence you mentioned, Dusty, I think the second challenging part is, well, the first part I feel I can grasp, which is the contrast between lesses and more, right? At the very least, there is a kind of shift or transition, right? But the second issue I find isn't that there are individual words in the sentence I don't understand. Rather, it's that the information in the sentence is just too abstract, isn't it? I mean, I can understand every single word. Phyto is life. Protesters is, what is this? This is process. Manipulated means to operate or to handle. I understand every word, but the sentence itself, it's like it's stripped away too much, you know? It's piled up with too many abstract elements. As a result, I feel the information is a bit vague, a bit floaty. If I try to force a translation, I'm not even sure what I'm saying. This is exactly what I see happening with many students when they're doing reading comprehension exercises, right? When they encounter sentences like this, their minds just freeze up. It's not that they don't understand the words they W. What they end up writing shows that they haven't really thought it through. For example, if a student is doing a reading comprehension test, they might write something like, historians are less interested in applying ideal historical explanations and reasoning to this organic function. This is what I mean by not really thinking. That's what I see when I look at your reading comprehension results. Your logic here, the words themselves are correct, but you haven't really used your mind to think through the logic. Why? Because when we read your answer, it feels like you're just translating the words literally without any real logical thinking. So does that really count as logical thinking? Now let's consider, what should the logic of this sentence actually look like? When you encounter so many abstract concepts, you need to learn how to simplify them. You need to learn to use plain language to really get to the heart of what this sentence is about. What is its central concept? The first key idea is shifting focus, right? Originally, the interest was in A, but later the interest shifted to B, redirected their attention. This corresponds to the earlier turning point, doesn't it? Now, what's the second key point? It's about whose attention is being discussed. Let's think about how to create a contrast here. What's the good part? In the earlier part, the explanation uses a historical perspective, right? So what about the other approach besides historical explanation? The other approach is to use experiments to manipulate variables. These two methods should be quite clear to see. All right, so at this point, you don't need to translate every single word, literally. It's not about some organic function or complex life mechanism. It's actually quite simple. Just imagine it as something personified, turn it into something relatable. Originally, scholars tried to use explanatory methods, specifically historical explanations. Now, they are starting to conduct experiments in laboratories. In the past, scholars would only theorize verbally, speculating about what its history might have looked like, using historical approaches to think about it. Now they are starting to use empirical methods to think about these questions. Isn't that a great improvement? In the past, people would just imagine who came first and who came later in history. But now, instead of just talking about history, they are actually getting hands-on and looking at the evidence. This is what we call processed information. Okay, so when you come to do intensive reading practice, I want you to think back and reflect on what kind of intensive reading training you are actually doing. If you go back and look at your notes and realize that you don't really understand them, that you've just written down all the literal meanings, but the information doesn't feel natural, then that's something to pay attention to. That means you're doing it wrong. Okay, so when I review your intensive reading exercises, what you write out during our one-on-one sessions, I always look at it from this perspective. I'm not asking you to just translate every single word. My focus is always on whether you've grasped the main idea of the sentence. For example, in this part, if someone writes that historians are less likely to focus on, or rather scholars are less likely to focus on using history to explain things, that's the kind of understanding I'm looking for. Instead, they tend to focus more on using experiments to observe, to use experiments to prove their points. Even though they haven't written out or translated every single word, I would say that they have fully understood the meaning. Okay, so that's the concept I want you to grasp. Now, let's look at these two sentences, or rather, these 4 lines. The main point is that they describe for us the shift in focus throughout history. Next, let's look at the following sentence, which says, but it is impossible to discuss the history of biology in the 19th century without emphasizing that those areas of biology, at least in the public eye, have depended on historical explanation. Well, this is exactly the kind of sentence I mentioned earlier, one of the more challenging sentences in this article, right? Why is that? Actually, there isn't much in this sentence, is there? I think the distinctive feature of this article is that it doesn't really contain any difficult vocabulary. In this sentence, I believe you can understand every single word. But the question is, where does the difficulty lie? First of all, why are there so many negatives in this sentence? Impossible without, right? All right, let's continue. If you stop at this point in the sentence, if you stop at this part, it's still manageable. But then why is there another verb added afterward? I'm not sure what the main point of the sentence is for you. All right, so when you encounter situations like this, please remember that fixed expressions within the sentence are quite important. When you come across double negatives, you need to turn 2 negatives into a positive. All right. It is impossible to do something without something. Okay, so if you leave something out, it's impossible, meaning it's essential. In other words, it is necessary. Okay, for example, if today we want to talk about 19th century biology, okay, then there's something we absolutely must do. You need to take responsibility for this before you can continue thinking further. So if you find that when you're working with long and complex sentences, you often struggle with double negatives, I suggest that you, after starting over, try to combine these 2 negatives and eliminate them together so that 2 negatives make a positive. Okay, there is nothing impossible. What does that mean? If you want to accomplish something, what must you do? Okay, now this doesn't mean it's guaranteed to succeed or that it's definitely possible. It just means that if you want it to be possible, do you remember what I said in class? I mentioned Shuфei, right? The opposite of impossible is not always and is not 100% sure. So what does it mean? It means that without something, nothing is possible. In other words, only when you have something does it become possible. But having something doesn't mean it's guaranteed. So in other words, if we want to achieve something, we first need to take certain actions. That's how it works. For example, if we want to discuss the history of biology in the 19th century, we need to emphasize one thing. All right, let's start reading from here again. We need to stress that the history at that time, what most of the public saw as history, was actually determined by how history was interpreted, meaning it was shaped into the version of biology that most of the public understood. It all depends on using history as the lens for interpretation. All right, so here you might ask, Dustin, what is the relationship between this sentence and the previous one? Well, didn't we just say that perspectives are shifting, right? In the past, things were explained through history, but later on, explanations relied on experiments, correct? So why does this sentence cause is it opposing the previous statement? Actually, it's not really opposing it. If you think this sentence is expressing opposition, that means you're only focusing on the key words. May I ask, what is the premise for opposition? It's only when someone else has a stance that you can oppose it, right? May I ask, is the previous sentence a stance? It's not a stance. It's a fact, isn't it? If you think this is opposition, then you need to reflect on whether you just treated the previous sentence as an argument. The tense used in that sentence is the simple past, which simply expresses a fact. The fact from the past is that at that time, the focus of research shifted from a focus on historical interpretation to, as we just discussed, experiments. This is a fact, and there's really no one who would oppose a fact. So this part does not indicate an attitude of opposition. So what kind of attitude is it then? Let's look at the previous sentence. What is the author trying to convey? If we want to talk about biology at that time, we still need to value it. In fact, biology back then was actually built upon historical interpretation. So what he is implying is not opposition to anyone. He is emphasizing the importance of historical interpretation, isn't he? The point is that although perspectives have shifted, we cannot ignore it just because of this shift. You need to understand that for quite a long period in the past, everyone still approached things in this way to conduct academic research. All right, let's pause here for a moment. We've just summarized a few challenging points. The first characteristic of difficult questions is that their sentence structure is complex, like the double negatives we just saw, right? The tone can also be complicated. Or sometimes the sentences are drawn out and lengthy. So what advice do we have for you? The first suggestion is when you encounter double negatives, try to group them together. Turn two negatives into a positive, but only do this when it's appropriate. Please pay attention to that. Don't forget the underlying logic. For example, the opposite of impossible is not always. The opposite of impossible is possible. Okay, next, make sure you grasp the main logical thread of the entire sentence, right? The main logic is just like the parallel structure we discussed earlier. And then what else? Next, you need to learn how to practice speak plainly and actively simplify information. However, you should still try to make the information as complete as possible, just like when you're talking to others in daily life. So do we usually train these skills? Yes, we do. It just depends on whether you're practicing seriously, right? For example, with complex long sentences, haven't we been collecting the types of long sentences you're afraid of? If we notice you have trouble with long sentences, we gather those challenging examples and design exercises for you. See, we're already doing this, aren't we? Also, haven't we emphasized that every time you do a reading exercise, you must use plain language? Don't just do a literal word-for-word translation. Really think about it. If you were the author, how would you express it? This is something you need to practice as well, right? For example, when it comes to negation or expressing the opposite, haven't we also discussed this in class? So actually, all of our courses cover these practice methods and design approaches. The key is whether you are diligently carrying them out every day and whether you truly understand what you are doing. When it comes to the official exam, it's very difficult to make up for this part at that point. Why? Because during the official exam, you can't get any external feedback, right? If your basic skills are solid in your daily practice, at the very least, you'll know exactly what you're working on, and what you're practicing will truly appear in the more challenging questions on the exam. So let me show you. These are questions that score above 700 on the test. Our regular practice specifically targets these kinds of problems. All right, let's continue and take a look at wherever it was applied. Historical aspiration was deemed also explanation wherever it is. What surprise? All right, this is an example of that kind of question. When a question word is followed by error, it means no matter what. So in this context, it's like saying no matter where this concept is applied here. R refers to the previous concept, right? No matter where this concept is used, historical explanation is always regarded as what? It is seen as using causality, specifically British style causality, to explain things. Causa here refers to cause and effect. In other words, when people at the time talked about historical explanation, what they really meant was taking events and linking them through cause and effect. That's the idea, okay? All right, now, the biologist historian and the general historian of human events deal with comparable phenomena and assume, in essence, a common mode of explanation. It's saying that both the biologist who acts as a historian and the general historian who truly studies history, not biology, these two types of people, actually approach things in a similar way. So what do they have in common? They both deal with similar phenomena, and importantly, they both presuppose that behind these similar phenomena, they use the same set of logic to handle and explain them. So here you need to be especially careful because it seems like they're starting to compare these two different roles, right? Now, as we've mentioned before, if you still have questions about boarding idea questions on the exam, or if you struggle with evaluation type questions, you really need to pay close attention to the details in the passage, right? Earlier, we mentioned the difference, which was about not focusing on one thing, but focusing on another. But here, there's a similarity you need to pay attention to. The passage starts to point out the similarities between biologists and historians of that time. They both paid attention to explaining the causes and effects of things. Okay, so that's the first paragraph. After reading it, it seems there isn't really a main argument, right? It's just telling you that the roles in research at that time were shifting, and the author is introducing you to how history was explained back then, rather, introducing the scholars of that era. Previously, what they used were historical explanations, and then it moves on to their own historical interpretations. In fact, these are actually connected to the interpretations of real historians. Right, so that's the first paragraph. Now, after reading the first paragraph, we can start to imagine what might come up next in the article, since we're not even halfway through, right? It's possible that the article will soon tell you, for example, what are the drawbacks of these two ways of interpreting history, such as the disadvantages of historical explanations. Next, it might shift to discussing the advantages of experimental explanations. That's one possible direction, right? It's also possible. Today, we're not making any judgments. The author might just keep describing what historical explanations actually look like or what impact historical explanations have had later on. In that case, it would be a purely narrative article, wouldn't it? All right, as we've discussed in class. The structure could either continue to explain what this thing is, what impact it has, and what its origins are, or we might go on to evaluate it, whether the impact it has had is good or bad. So is this thing right or wrong? That's the kind of evaluation we're talking about, right? Let's keep going. He says that 19th century biologists found it useful to use history to explain things. In other words, to use the causal relationships we just discussed to explain biological functions. This approach was interesting and appealing. Now, pay attention. When you're reading the text, you should always remember to look out for common fixed phrases in English. For example, with the word find, you can't just see find and immediately think it means to discover. Sometimes when this word is used, it's not just followed by a direct object, but also by a complement. Like here, it's find something attractive, meaning to find something to be a certain way. All right, so the key point of this sentence is not that they discovered the explanation, but rather that they found the explanation itself to be good, okay, to be attractive. So what is the reason for this? Partly is because their observation of the formation of the new cell from pre-existing life seemed to confirm a historical explanation of self-generation. Well, they found this example to be a good explanation. Why? Well, They observe the formation of a new cell. A new cell emerged from an existing cell. This observation seems to be able to confirm their historical explanation. What does it mean for an observation to confirm something? You see, if you try to keep all the modifiers and information from the sentence in your mind at once, it can be overwhelming. But if you just do a literal translation, you might say, because they observed that the new cell came from the original cell, they felt this explanation was good. But that makes the sentence too convoluted. Look, there aren't any words in this sentence that you don't understand. But even if you know all the words, if you haven't learned how to simplify information and extract the main idea, you'll still find the sentence hard to comprehend. All right, let's rethink this. How can we put this sentence into plain language? What is its core structure? The main point is actually that someone finds something interesting or good, and there's a reason for that. Think about it. I think this explanation is good. Now, I need to explain the reason why it's good. So what comes after is the reason. Therefore, when interpreting the next part of the sentence, the focus should be on that reason. Whenever there's a strength or advantage, you need to interpret it in a more personal, human way. You need to dig into why exactly it's good, rather than just translating the word good, literally. Let me compare the two approaches for you. If you don't realize that the second half of the sentence must focus on what exactly is good, what will happen? Your interpretation might end up saying that this discovery or observation where new cells are produced from an old cell seems to confirm the history of cell formation. But in reality, your explanation would become very rigid, wouldn't it? However, if you already understand that the main idea of the first half of the sentence is to explain or discuss this point, a historical explanation is good. And then in the latter half of the sentence, you have a phrase starting with because. What you need to focus on is the reason, right? So you need to explain why something good is actually good. Therefore, you should talk about its advantages. So what is the advantage in this sentence? What does it say can be used? The advantage we have is what? Is that we can use observation to confirm that our explanation is correct. The benefit is that we can use observation to verify it. How many explanations are there? How many hypotheses cannot be confirmed through observation, things we simply cannot see? Would those kinds of explanations still count as good explanations? Would they still be considered correct explanations? Not necessarily, right? But because we can use evidence, we can use it. Observation to verify. So this explanation is a good one. I hope you all understand this well. When you're reading information, you'll find yourself digging deeper. And deeper this is absolutely normal because any article will naturally have both shallow and deep sections with more detailed content. And when you're looking at these details, you can't just zone out and only focus on the literal meaning of the words. So how do you keep your mind from going blank? The literal meaning is that you should always get used to reading the first half of the sentence to change the information in the second half of the sentence. You should make inferences at the inner level about what the second half of the sentence should logically explain. The first half of the sentence says that this method, this explanation is very good. Let's pause here because now you should be thinking that what comes next should be about the advantages of this explanation. Then the latter part says that observation can be used to confirm the explanation. So why is this an advantage? Because many hypotheses just remain as random thoughts in our minds, right? But if today we have evidence that can prove it, isn't that much better? It's that simple. So you can simplify the sentence to mean that scholars at the time believed this explanation was good because there was no evidence to disprove it. Okay, all right, let's continue. You see, it seems like this isn't just a matter of vocabulary, right? Many students have noticed this and said, Teacher Huang, your diagnostic labels are really helpful. I find that I can understand every single word. But when I put the whole sentence together, I still don't get it. So today, you should really understand why you can't comprehend it because your information processing is too superficial. You haven't put in the necessary effort. Okay, so during the exam, things won't be explained in as much detail as I'm doing now. But if you have a solid foundation from your regular practice, your intuition will naturally be strong, right? It's just that simple. All right, let's keep going. All right. The same direct observation of continuous stages of development was also possible when they examined the compressed sequence of events of embryogenesis. Now, of course, there's a proper noun in this sentence. As your teacher, I want to tell you that it's okay if you don't understand this proper noun. The key is that you first need to understand what the previous sentence was talking about, right? As we just discussed in the previous sentence. The advantage of historical explanation is that we can truly verify it through observation. Now, you see here, it says the same direct observation. So you can start to anticipate what this sentence is likely to say that in another situation, we can also use observation to confirm it. That makes it even better, doesn't it? All right, so you see what it is, the same kind of continuous development. But those are possible when the exam, the compressed sequence or the end of embracing here essay refers to the realization of the embryo synthesis, that is the synthesis of the embryo. So in the same way, when we observe the process of embryonic development, we can also see this, right? We have direct observations that can serve as evidence. So what this means is we think this is good. Historical explanations are considered good because sometimes we can't use direct evidence to prove them. But here, you see, we have another kind of evidence. When we look at embryos, we can also see and provide proof in this way, right? So in both of these situations, the observers will have a clear, definite, and distinct impression. The word impression here means an idea or perception, okay? But this impression isn't a deeply thought out idea. Rather, it's more like, it's like when we often talk about a first impression, right? Is a first impression a deep, well-considered thought? No, right? It's just an idea that comes to you directly, something that suddenly comes over you. So all these observers found that there's always a very clear, immediate thought. This is what we mean by an impression, a thought that just comes over you. To put it another way, the data cell was brought into being or influenced by the previous cell. Because as we can see in these two examples, the daughter cell is produced by the mother cell, or rather it is caused by the mother cell. So based on these observations, we tend to think that there's a causal relationship between the two. You see, it's connected to the idea of causality. Now, moving on, it says the argument that this scientist employed confuses temporal succession. And also explanation, of course. But such confusion is at the heart of most historical explanations. Now, what do we see happening here? The tone seems to become a bit critical, doesn't it? Why? Because we see a very important word here, confuse. Confuse means to mix up or to blur distinctions, right? So when we talk about confusion, we often refer to it as a conceptual fallacy or equivocation. In other words, you're mixing up two concepts and not distinguishing them clearly. Therefore, this sentence could very well be a criticism from the author. He's saying that although scholars at the time claimed, based on my observations, I believe this can be explained historically, the author thinks that's not necessarily the case. It's possible that you're confusing two different things, specifically temporal continuity. Now, don't assume that the word temporal here means temporary, okay? Right, temperance is the one that means moderation. And temperament refers to temperament or disposition. These are not about time. Temper relates to time, okay? And succession does not mean success, all right? So you really need to memorize your vocabulary well. Let me just say, I've noticed that your vocabulary is lacking. When I look at your reading assessments, you often misunderstand words, so I'll ask you to memorize vocabulary. There's a reason for this. Even though memorizing vocabulary can be tedious, you see, if you misunderstand the meaning, temporary victory, you'll find it confusing. What does temporary victory even mean? Here, it actually refers to an achievement in terms of time. All right, it's about the order in time. It actually means time sequence. If you interpret it as something temporary, then you'll be a bit off and you really won't understand the text, okay? This is exactly what I'm talking about. In high difficulty questions, there are a lot of abstract words and many of them are similar in meaning. So if you accidentally confuse one word with another, you'll find the passage almost impossible to read. That's why high level passages are really a battle of vocabulary. I experienced this myself during exams when I was scoring around 760. I felt like, wow, every passage was filled with words I didn't understand. If I didn't know them, I was done for. Honestly, if you get stuck there, there's nothing you can do but watch the time tick away. There's no point in staying stuck because you know the meaning you're guessing is probably wrong since the logic just doesn't add up, right? But you just get completely stuck there. That's the hallmark of difficult exam questions. Okay, let's keep going. Here, it mentions something that feels a bit off. Just because one thing happens before another, you can't treat it as a cause and effect relationship. Actually, that's exactly what the sentence means. But this kind of conceptual substitution, this kind of confusion is really at the core of most historical explanations. Okay, all right. So now we can see that the author seems to have pointed out a problem with historical explanation. Next, will this article shift to having the author criticize the shortcomings of past historical explanations? After criticizing, it then shifts to discussing a new direction called experimental explanation. It's very likely that many articles are written this way. First, they introduce an old method. After explaining the old method, they point out its shortcomings and then present the new method, explaining how it improves upon those shortcomings. You've probably read countless articles like this. But don't forget another possibility. This article might only talk about the shortcomings, or it might just leave those shortcomings aside and discuss something else. So our predictions about the article need to be dynamically adjusted. You see, I've developed a good habitat at the end of each section. I always share with you what I think might come next. And my predictions are never fixed, right? The article isn't even halfway through yet, so there's no need to change our view just now. Once we're steadily past the halfway point, but there's still a section left, let's take a look at the third paragraph first. He says, not surprisingly, meaning it's not unexpected. All right, the evolutionary biologists of the 19th century encountered a particularly troublesome problem in the attempt to judge human historical explanation. Convinced how? As expected, those 19th century evolutionary biologists, when they attempted to explain these complex and intricate histories in a truly convincing and comprehensive way, right? When they try to clarify and make sense of these historical explanations, they inevitably encountered a significant and challenging problem. So what exactly was this particular problem? It was, in fact, the factual and detailed record of the history of life on Earth. For example, the record provided by fossils is extremely incomplete. So what is the problem here? Well, we want to provide historical explanations, but our data is incomplete, right? Now look at how long this sentence is, isn't it? But in fact, where should the focus of this sentence be? The first is, not surprisingly. The attitude he points out here is not a negative one. He is the author of the article, and the attitude expressed earlier, well, we just discussed that there was an issue with the previous attitude, right? The early attitude was that these historical explanations themselves are confused in terms of chronological order and cannot be regarded as causal relationships. So you can reasonably expect that since the attitude is not negative, this part should continue to discuss the sequence of events in the timeline. We cannot simply regard certain details about Britain in this way. Now here we encounter a problem. If you want to use chronological signals as evidence of causality, but we see that some records are actually incomplete, how should you approach the situation? Right? If the chronological or factual records are incomplete, then how can you use time to prove your point? Okay, so you see, with these highly challenging articles, every part is closely interconnected. I often say that the first third of an article determines success or failure. Why is that? It's not just because, as I mentioned in class, we need to pay attention to the main topic and the first argument in the first third of the article, right? Well, that's not the only reason. There are other reasons as well. As the information in the article continues to accumulate, isn't that so? If you don't have a clear understanding of each sentence at the beginning, if you can't anticipate what might come next or understand the purpose behind what the author just said, if you aren't actively thinking about this information, your reading will become increasingly unfocused as you continue. This concept is your foundation. In reality, if you don't lay a solid foundation when building a house, the structure above will become increasingly unstable. It could even shake violently like an earthquake. So What we understand from this sentence is that, in fact, factual records are incomplete. Factual records are incomplete. All right. So this connects to what we just discussed. You want to use time as a reference, but in reality, you haven't paid attention to the time records. Right. That's exactly the problem here. All right. Let's continue with the temporal continuity of living forms was convincing. Of course, when it comes to living organisms, the temporal continuity of biological forms seems reasonable. However, what is the underlying assumption, the one that was particularly difficult to uphold or maintain, especially when one carefully compared different species of organisms that are forming any two distinct stages of the evolutionary records, or perhaps even more subtle transitions between those stages? All right, this is tricky, I have to say. The structure of this sentence actually isn't. Difficult, it really isn't. Also, the vocabulary itself isn't very hard, right? But I believe you've probably found yourself in a dilemma here. All right, you can understand the first part, right? The first half of the sentence is clear. It's saying that for organisms, if you want to find continuity in the evolutionary lineage, it needs to appear convincing, right? Convincing here means persuasive. But it was an assumption that was difficult to uphold. Why do we say that temporal continuity itself is a difficult assumption to maintain? What does it mean when we compare different species or different organisms today? When forming or comparing any two stages of evolutionary records, there are problems when we compare different organisms or different stages in the evolutionary process. Now, I have to say, I need to address something first. Do you actually need specialized knowledge for GMAT? No, you don't. The official statement is that GMAT never tests specialized knowledge. What it tests is common sense. All right, I agree with that. However, you must know what their definition of common sense is and how far you are from meeting that standard. We have to acknowledge this. First, their definition of common sense is that of an American high school graduate, right? Now, is what we are taught the same as what Americans are taught? It doesn't seem to be exactly the same. Americans understand Native Americans. Do we know about Native American tax rights? Do we understand the rulings of the federal courts on these matters? Not necessarily. If you were tested on East Asian history, would you know it? Maybe you do relatively okay in that case. Now, the second point, Americans talk about evolution, right? Actually, we used to teach that as well, but here's where the problem arises. Do you still remember the concepts of evolution? Is it considered common knowledge? That's right, we really did teach it in the past. But after all this time after graduating from high school, even from a good university, and having experienced the challenges of society, do you still understand it? You've forgotten, haven't you? So sometimes when I arrange training for students, I have them focus on more challenging areas, specifically those fields they're less familiar with, and read more articles in those areas. This is meaningful because by reading these articles, you can grasp some of the basic concepts in the field you're afraid of, right? Only then can you keep moving forward, right? Okay, so what am I trying to say here? I'm saying that in terms of evolution, there are actually different stages, different phases, okay? Now, these stages might be separated by long periods of time and may not be continuous. For example, let's say today you mentioned, humans like our current Homo sapiens also have very primitive forms. Have you seen that picture? From apes, they have evolved into upright modern Homo sapiens, right? Homosexuality, you compare the current Homo sapiens with the ape man who jumped through several generations and evolutionary stages a long time ago. How can you convince people with this? With this kind of concept, you don't have the assumption of continuity because the time gaps are just too long. So you see, even when it comes to speaking in plain language, it really requires some fundamental effort, background knowledge, and also inference. Let's reason through this a bit. So I have to say, these things are actually the basic skills you develop through regular comprehensive practice. And they're the questions that people often ask. It's not like I keep telling everyone that test-taking strategies can solve everything. No, test-taking strategies are just the final demonstration of your reasoning ability. All right, but you still need to have those fundamental reading skills beforehand. Okay, so we still need to formally talk about the things that the main idea is trying to address, some of which we might not have. Or maybe we once had them but have since forgotten. Okay, all right, let's keep going and look at the next part. Their solution today appears to be only verbal. So are these explanations for the problem correct? All right, sorry, I just skipped a sentence by accident. Back then, scientists realized, oh no, if I cross several evolutionary eras, the timeline becomes discontinuous. So how am I supposed to convince people that these two things are causally related, right? How are you supposed to convince people? The time gap between those apes from tens of millions of years ago and modern humans is so huge, not just hundreds of years ago. Sorry, it should be tens of millions of years ago. With such a big time gap, how do you persuade people that our ancestors were those beings, right? Isn't that so? All right. So students have also noticed this problem. The time span is just too long. How exactly are you supposed to establish a causal relationship? They've tried to solve this too. So how did they go about it? Well, looking at it today, it seems they just used verbal explanations. What does verbal mean? You might see verbal and wonder, what is that? It's a subject on an exam. Of course, I'm taking the verbal section. And usually I just talk nonsense just saying verbal. It basically means verbal reasoning. And what it really implies is that you haven't actually proven anything through experiments. You're just reasoning things out verbally. So their explanations, looking at them today, might seem like they were just making things up, saying whatever came to mind, just letting their imagination run wild as soon as they started talking. But I still stand by regarding it as the main proposal, okay? At the time, it really did seem very convincing, very good, with the strength of a solid British explanation. What I mean is, when we look at the proposal he put forward back then, from today's perspective, the proposal he used at the time to solve the problem of discontinuity in time. Now it seems like it was just empty talk, but back then it really felt so convincing, like the causal relationship was really solid. So what exactly was still left unsaid? Next he says, the fact of evolution demands some connection between all reproducing individuals and the species that they compose. So what are the conditions for evolution? The condition is that all individuals with reproductive ability, well, not just those who have the ability, but those who are actually reproducing, and the species they form must be connected to each other. You might say, this sentence is really hard to understand if I just translate it word for word. It doesn't make sense. But if you combine it with some basic knowledge of evolutionary biology, you'll realize that this connection refers to biological characteristics, the kind of connection that exists between them. For example, if the previous species had two hands, right, I also have two hands. Or there might be genetic connections that are inherited, right? So when you look at this sentence, even though everything seems vague and full of abstract terms, like what does connection mean? What are reproductive individuals? What does the species they form refer to? You might feel, oh, it's all so unclear, just a bunch of abstract nouns. But at this point, you need to make use of your knowledge. You reason it out, okay? It probably means that my previous generation of species and the next generation, for example, birds, evolved from dinosaurs, or similar concepts like that. They all have wings, and the wings are similar. But they all grasp it, right? Or like us and the stars, their guests all have hands, so the shapes of the hands are similar. There is a connection, or they are genetically similar. This is called connection. Okay, then what is their liberation? Next sentence, the solution, the concept of heredity. Here comes heredity at last. So you see, the information is connected, right? Just now, we thought that connections could be about appearance or what else? They could be behavioral connections or genetic connections. Here, it's very clear the connection is about heredity, like DNA. Or inherited traits, right? So the solution they're thinking of is a biological phenomenon, the inheritance of traits. This idea of heredity seems to fill in the gap in an admittedly deficient historical record, and seems to complete the argument for historical explanation of evolutionary events, as if it can fill in the gaps, the missing parts, the historical blanks in the historical record. It seems as if it can complete the entire historical process in genetics. All right, now that we've finished reading this article, let's not move on to the questions just yet. First, quickly think about what we've previously discussed, what you should consider after reading an article. First, if you were the author, what would you do? What kind of summary would you give for each paragraph? What is your basic attitude? What is the main theme of this article, right? The theme of this article should emphasize how these biologists in the past approached things. It should stress how they explain biological phenomena. So what does the author think? The author believes that the way they explained things in the past was mainly through historical causal explanations. The author also briefly mentioned that this historical explanatory approach has some shortcomings, such as the inability to maintain continuity over time. But it also mentions how the people involved strengthen their arguments by using genetics to reinforce their reasoning, right? So as for whether the author further refutes genetics, it seems that he does not. Therefore, you could say that the author's criticism is not particularly strong. He mainly tends to introduce the views of those involved, point out some issues with their ideas, and explain how the problem was addressed at the time. However, the author does not launch a major attack. He is more like someone still in the stage of presenting information. All right, so after reading the entire article, I would say that if we're talking about the main idea or the primary attitude of this piece, its focus isn't on review. Rather, its focus is still on presentation. Okay, so present anyway. We've finally finished discussing this article, but we still have a lot of questions left to do. So let's move on to the questions now. Sigh. This part is really difficult, which is why I explained it in such detail earlier, because I want you to understand that the value of this question doesn't lie in simply understanding its story. If it were just about telling the story, I wouldn't even need to explain. I could just put the text into GPT, because this story won't appear again in future exams. Once it's tested, it just becomes a practice question. What I want you to understand first is how you should approach your regular practice and remediation. Okay, so for all the problems and difficulties you encounter while doing exercises, we need to systematize them. Identify exactly which abilities you're lacking, and I need to tell you how to address those gaps. This is what really matters. So you should start to get a sense of this now. When you're reading an article, are you truly engaging deeply with the information in the first third of the text and making inferences? Did you use your earlier inferences to make predictions about the later parts of the text? If you haven't been doing these things, then these are the specific areas you need to practice now. Right, let's move on to the questions. The first question asks, what is the main purpose of this article? My habit is to come up with a preliminary answer before looking at the options, right? Okay, so let me think about my preliminary answer. Usually, the options for main idea questions follow a certain pattern, a verb followed by the topic, and then a description of the topic. So my preliminary answer should start with a verb something like to show the author's attitude. The author is somewhat critical, though the criticism isn't that harsh. But mainly, the author is describing the reasoning methods used by the people involved, right? So If I were to give a preliminary answer, I'd say it should be something like describing how 19th century biologists conducted their biological research, specifically the methods they use, which were primarily historical explanations. Causal explanation is another method. That's my initial thought. Okay, so let's use this idea to quickly compare the 5 options and see which ones differ too much from our direction. Okay, if it's too far off, it won't work. For example, option A, what does it say? It talks about comparing information obtained through historical explanations. Okay, comparing it with information obtained through experiments, this is clearly incorrect. Why? Because the article isn't really about making comparisons. Although there are indeed some comparisons in the article, if this article were truly comparing historical explanations with experimental explanations, then in theory, experimental explanations should also be discussed in detail in the latter part of the article. So both should be covered here. What is a historical explanation? What is an experimental explanation? And why would there be absolutely no room for experiments later on? So option A cannot be our answer. This is clear. Okay. That's settled. As for option B, it says that the author's purpose is to evaluate the inference that theories of history add on development in the field of biology in the 19th century to evaluate whether these kinds of historical explanations or historical theories are correct and what impact they had on the academic field of biology. Okay, let's continue, everyone. Pay attention. This impact implies a very strong sense of causality. The meaning of the word or verb impact here is that it later caused something to happen. But when we just looked at the article, we only saw the problems with the explanation itself, some minor flaws, right? However, we didn't see who was subsequently influenced by this explanation. We didn't see anything like, because historians or biologists used historical explanations, it led to certain things happening in academia. We didn't see that. So we can't say that it later caused any particular impact. If impact is required as the answer, then this part should mention that because of such an explanation, certain later theories emerged, or the academic community later conducted certain types of research, or that there were some changes in academia afterward. But none of that is present here. So it doesn't actually mention any resulting impact. Therefore, option B is not our answer. However, this option is a distractor because many people might think it's about this historical explanation, but you need to pay close attention to the causal elements present in the options. Okay, now what about option C? It says that this article is discussing the importance of historical explanation in the thinking of 19th century biologists. The first thing about this option is that it uses the word discuss, which is a very general verb. It could be a positive discussion, negative discussion, or even a neutral one. As long as you're talking about it, it counts as a discussion. Okay, no problem. In this part, the topic also matches. It really is about 19th century scholars and their use of historical explanation, right? The importance here, it doesn't take a particularly strong or forceful stance. He's simply emphasizing this thing itself, that's all. So although the discussion of importance isn't entirely satisfactory, because if you want to talk about importance, you probably still need to explain what this thing's contribution actually is. But at least compared to option B, this strong causality is definitely incorrect. Because in the article, it doesn't say that this historical explanation later caused any particular impact. So option C, I would say it's not entirely satisfactory, but for now, it seems we can keep it as a possible answer. Okay, as for the other options, some mention comparing, for example, biologists show they use historical explanations differently in the early and later periods. But the article doesn't make any comparisons about chronological order, right? Although the article starts by talking about a turning point, it doesn't go on to discuss the sequence of events later on. It doesn't talk about comparing the situation in the first half of the 19th century versus the second half. None of that is mentioned. So those options are definitely not the answers we're looking for. So what about option E? It says that the main focus of this article is to evaluate how the concept of heredity has changed. In the 19th century, these biologists used historical explanations. But if heredity really was a key point, why would it only appear in the very last sentence of the article, right? So if the main point of this article truly was to evaluate how the concept of heredity has changed, then the scholars at the time would have interpreted it differently. Heredity should have appeared here, and then the article would have gone on to explain in detail how it changed, right? So it's clear that this part is also not the main focus of the article. Therefore, the real focus of the entire article should still be describing how historical explanations were used back then. Of course, the word important itself isn't particularly precise. Why? Because we haven't really discussed many of his contributions, but at least this is stronger than option B. Speaking from a British perspective, all right, logically speaking, it doesn't stray too far, so the answer isn't option C. Okay, let's look at the second question. The second question says, according to the article, everyone, pay attention to this, according to the article. We've talked about this in class before. According to the article means it's a supporting idea question, right? The key point of a supporting idea question is that you only say as much as the evidence allows it if the article doesn't mention it. Don't bring it up. You can't say, I think the author would probably agree with this too. That's not how it works. That's called an inference question. Okay, for a supporting idea question, you really can only rely on what's in the article. Let's see what it says. According to the information in the article, which of the following belongs to 19th century biologists? Okay, and the correct statement about the way historians explain things as well. In other words, it needs to talk about both people at the same time. At this point, of course, we need to locate where this is discussed, right? You can imagine that the latter part of the article should mostly be talking about, for example, the biologists and their ideas. So where should the discussion about historians be? It should be right here. This is what we mean when we talk about locating the prediction point. What is the prediction point for locating? It's when the article presents similarities or differences for comparison. That's when it might test you on supporting idea questions, right? All right, now let's go back and look at houseboat. Okay, it's impossible for us to When discussing biology at that time, it's impossible not to talk about them. The main focus of biology back then was on historical explanations. In other words, if you want to talk about biology of that era, you have to figure out what the main focus of biology was in section 10. No matter where it was used, historical explanation was always regarded as a form of causal explanation. At that time, this was the main focus for biologists. Here come the biologists and also the historians. They were all dealing with similar phenomena. They all used the same approach to explain things. So on one side, they were dealing with human issues and affairs, and on the other, with the history of living organisms, right? Okay, now let's look at the second question. So what would my answer be here? The similarity between the two is that the way they think is similar, and the phenomena they encounter are also similar. This is stated directly in the article. Information, right. Now, let's first look at what option A says. It says that neither historians nor biologists have developed methods that are, accepted by peers, whether they are accepted by their colleagues or not. The article we just read didn't tell us anything about how accepted these two people are by others, right? So when you see this, you can immediately eliminate it. This is a complete fabrication. We didn't see anything about how others evaluate them at all, okay? So what does option B say? Biologists, the methods they use to explain phenomena need to change significantly. The first half of the sentence might still be considered correct. Why? Because the article did mention that they shifted their focus from historical explanations to what? To using experiments. So the first half can still be inferred. However, the latter part of the sentence says that the methods used by historians did not change, but the article did not mention whether historians had any turning point or not. So you also can be sure. Okay, so option B cannot be inferred. What does option C say? It says that biologists believe they have refined, means to improve. They have refined the methods of historians. But in the passage, we only saw that they used similar methods, right? All right, but it never said who improved upon whose methods, so we can eliminate this option. Now, everyone, pay attention. When I'm explaining, I'll immediately take you back to look at the details in the passage. But when you're doing the questions yourself, you can't do that. In other words, when you're answering, you should first think it through and make predictions, then rely on your method. Use your predictions to go through all 5 options once. If you feel that some options don't quite make sense logically, then of course eliminate them. If you don't think so, make sure you don't go back to the passages for the sake of that option. For example, you shouldn't say, I remember Dusty was in the video, and this option C only tells half the story. So I'll check the passage to see if it makes sense. No, you can't do that in this exam. You shouldn't do this in your regular practice either. Why? Because it will disrupt your answering rhythm. You should set it aside first and then go back to locate it again in the second round. You can't go back to the passage in the first round just for a particular option. If you do that, using 2 rounds to answer questions becomes inefficient. All right. So what does the multiple choice option say? It says that biologists and historians, when explaining what they believe to be comparable phenomena, use similar methods. Does this match the approach we just discussed? The methods are similar, the lines are similar, so we'll keep this option for now. All right, what about option E? It says that although both groups use similar methods, the methods used by biologists are less conservative in comparison. Apologetic here means conservative. Now, some students might say, who would know the meaning of the word apologetics on the Tustin exam, right? I have to say this is exactly what I mean by the characteristics of high difficulty questions. Okay, high difficulty questions have this feature. If you don't understand even one word, you're basically done for. So anyway, when you practice, make sure to build up your vocabulary. Of course, you can still use some clever tricks. What do I mean by clever tricks? Well, earlier it mentioned similar, and here it uses although, so what comes next should be about the differences. But the passage doesn't actually talk about the differences between historians and biologists, so this probably isn't the right answer. You can try to force your way through with this kind of reasoning. But I have to say, not every question lets you force your way through with this kind of reasoning. There really are some difficult questions where you get stuck simply because you don't understand a particular word. So do high difficulty questions actually test your solid vocabulary skills? Yes, they do. And what can you do about it? In an actual test, there's nothing you can do. You just have to move on. But if you encounter this during practice, you can take the opportunity to learn more vocabulary, and that's valuable material. Okay, so the issue here is it is not more conservative. There was no comparison of who is more conservative and who is not. So the answer is to read the options carefully. All right, now let's look at the next question. The third question asks, which of the following best summarizes the turning point mentioned in the second line of the second paragraph? Turning point, okay. All right, so let's take a look here. We're doing a summary, right? So let's go back and look at this sentence. What exactly is the turning point being referred to? It's that these biologists are less likely to use historical explanations to explain certain biological phenomena and functions. Instead, they focus more on exploring the course of life by using experimental methods. So if we want to summarize and simplify this, right? In conceptual terms, the summary is that they changed their research direction and methods. They abandoned purely historical explanations and started using experiments. It's just that simple. Once you've thought it through and summarized it, you can go back and look at the options. Okay, so here, what does the first key point refer to? Does it refer to the beginning of the conflict between historical explanations and experimenters? It doesn't seem like there's any conflict. It's just a transition. It doesn't say that studying abroad is a must, right? Okay, it doesn't say that every change of dynasty requires studying abroad. So this logic is different. It's not that every transition has to be a fierce struggle, like a life or death fight, right? Okay, so what's option B? Using historical explanations as a replacement. The British explanation. So here again, you need to be careful. This word is easily confused with another word's logic. They mean the same thing, but the order is different. Substitute means substitute A for B. Hey, you use the former to replace the latter. Replace is the opposite. If it's replace B with A, which means you use the latter to replace the former. I remember you all should have learned these fixed collocations back in high school, right? Back then, the teacher said it was very important, and it was even tested in exam. I believe if you haven't read much English, you would just forget it. So when does the consequence of forgetting come? It comes now, but that's okay. Now is practice time, so everyone should really remember this, okay? So pay attention here. The logic is reversed, because as we can see, the first one is turning point. It should be using experiments to replace historical explanations. Of course, it's not exactly the opposite. Rather, it's just completely irrelevant because these two actually mean the same thing. As we just mentioned in the article, historical explanation is equivalent to causality, right? The meaning is the same. But here, they insist on turning these two equivalent concepts into one replacing the other. Okay, so option B is also not the answer we're looking for. What does option C say? It says shifting from historical explanation to an interest in experiments. Well, that matches exactly what I expected, so let's keep it for now. What about the last option? It says suddenly starting to focus on the issue of organic functions. That's not it. Our focus is on whether it's a historical explanation or an experimental explanation, which has nothing to do with whether it's organic or not. So we can eliminate that option. What about option A? It says that public awareness of the controversy among biologists has increased. Our article doesn't care about the public at all, sorry. What we care about is the experimental method. So option E is also eliminated. Therefore, the final answer to this question is option C. All right, let's look at question 4. Question 4 says, the author is implying which 19th century scholars studied the origin of embryos, that is, this kind of thing called embryogenesis, those who research the mechanisms of embryogenesis. These scholars said, what did they say? All right, pay attention. This question is an inference question involving imprint. So of course we need to go back and look at a passage. Now, let's go back and see where the passage talks about these scholars. And remember, these aren't just any scholars. They are scholars who study embryos, right? All right, let's take a look. It should be around here. Of course, when we're reviewing, we shouldn't just look at this one sentence. I always recommend reading the previous sentence as well. As for whether you should look at the sentence before or after, I always tell students that you need to consider the context and tone of the sentence in the passage. Where does it start and where does it end? For example, regarding the tone of the sentence in this part, right? Actually, the entire paragraph shares the same tone, which is the author's attitude, correct? So I would suggest that you look at both the previous and the following sentences. But if we're talking about the order of reading, it's not possible for us to read backwards, right? So what should we do? If you decide to look at the previous sentence, you should also look at what comes after. I wouldn't just look at this one sentence. I would read the previous sentence first, then this one. In this way, okay, scholars found that they thought this historical explanation was great because they could use observation to verify it, right? They could use experiments to actually prove this explanation. Similarly, when we actually observe the continuous development at different levels, what can we do? We can also see this in embryonic development, right? Okay, so through observation, we can discover its true hey. It seems like one cell is formed after another, okay? So that's what's happening here. Now we can come back and try to answer the question. The author hints, if you were one of those scientists at the time, what would you be thinking? Your thoughts would be, I think I really can use observation to verify whether a historical explanation is correct, to test whether an explanation I imagine in my mind is accurate. I think this is credible because what you see is what you get. Seeing is believing. That's good. Now let's look at these options to see which ones match our thoughts. The first one suggests that those scholars discovered something, they found actual evidence. This evidence can support their use of historical explanations, which seems okay. Why? Because didn't we just say that we can use observation to verify whether historical explanation is correct? So does observation count as actual evidence? If observation doesn't count as real evidence, then what does? Isn't what you observe actual evidence? So we'll keep option A for now. All right, what about option B? It says word first. When looking at options like this, superlatives and extreme value statements like these pay special attention to them. Because in these cases, it's not that the test will definitely make them incorrect options, but they are very likely to be distractors or places where logical issues might appear. It says these scholars were the first group, the very first to say, we should use living organisms for systematic research. All right. Did he use living organisms? I don't know if he was among the first group. I don't know that either. In his article, he simply talks about them going to observe and look for evidence. On what basis can you say they conducted research on living organisms, or even claim they were the first to do so, right? So the logic here is completely wrong, okay? All right, next, what does option C say? Option C says these scholars were able to use historical explanation more systematically than biologists who did not study embryogenesis. They were more systematic than those scholars who did not study embryo. They made better use of it, were more capable of systematically applying historical explanations. First of all, as we just mentioned, This is simply an example we saw that we can use evidence to support an example or explanation. But it never praised anyone, saying you're amazing or better than others. We didn't make any comparisons between people, right? It never said who was better at using historical explanations, so option C is eliminated. All right, this is what I often call a confusing option. They especially like to make irrelevant comparisons, even though the article is simply presenting things side by side. Each concept is independent and parallel to the others. Yet, they insist on forcing parallel information into cause and effect or comparative relationships. This kind of confusion is really common in schools everywhere. If you haven't written this down, if you haven't noted it in your own notes, or if you haven't become aware of this issue yourself, then when you do exercises or encounter vocabulary in the future, it means you haven't truly grasped it. Think clearly about what the question patterns in the media look like. That's it. Okay, good. Next, let's look at the reading passage. It says these people unintentionally advertise this word. Advertise is just a normal word. If you don't understand it and just memorize it, then you'll unintentionally discover some important evidence about the history of life on Earth. The previous sentence doesn't really allow us to infer this, does it? All we know is that we can observe and verify our historical explanations, but it doesn't say that they can discover important evidence about the entire history of life. This is really exaggerated, isn't it? So this option isn't what we're looking for either. Now let's look at option E. What does option E say? Option E says that we can, or rather that it can avoid the reasoning used by most 19th century biologists, the common fallacies in their reasoning, but it doesn't actually say what's wrong with other people's reasoning. And these people in the article didn't avoid any mistakes either, right? In fact, the author even points out that they did make mistakes. Their mistake was confusing the timeline, but they confused England, didn't they? So actually it's the opposite. The author is saying they made mistakes. Only if you tell me how to avoid fallacies does it make sense. So the answer to this question should be option A. Now, we're finally getting to today's last question. Question 5. The passage would be most likely to appear in which of the following? This article is most likely to appear in which of the following publications? What kind of weird question is that, right? Questions like this usually only show up in high difficulty tests. I'm telling you, high difficulty questions often have some strange types. For example, I once saw an article about a grant, and it asked me if this article were to have another section. So the article originally had 3 paragraphs. If there were a 4th paragraph, what would it be about? All right. Or it might ask, if this article were to be published in a journal, what would the name of that journal be? Or something like that. Is that the concept? These kinds of odd questions can all show up. Or it might ask, if you were to replace the words in this section with the words below, or something similar, what would happen? All right. So if you see these kinds of odd questions on the exam, you can relax. Okay. You see the difficulty is right here, like this. But I want to say, don't try to guess during the exam, whether you're in the high score group or the low score group. There's no point in guessing. I often say that test takers tend to do things that are meaningless. The first big one is doing tons of practice questions, right? Do you know what the second one is? The second is taking mock exams and constantly estimating your score, which is also pretty pointless. I've told a lot of people this. After you finish a mock exam, if you get a high score, you won't really believe it. And if your score is low, you'll just get discouraged ahead of time. So what's the point of doing this, right? Okay. So that's the second pointless thing. Now, the third pointless thing is exactly what I just mentioned. Okay, during the exam, you find yourself constantly thinking, did I get this question right or wrong? Is this question going to drag my score down or not? No matter how much you think about it, the world won't change just for you. Okay, so don't dwell on this. But what I can tell you is that these are just high difficulty questions, sometimes with odd twists. So let's think about it. This is actually just a variation of a main idea question. In that case, I'll just use the logic for answering main idea questions. So following this logic, this article is mainly about the author introducing something, right? What's being introduced is a method that 19th century biologists once used to study organisms, which is called using historical explanations. Although it does mention a few minor drawbacks, overall, the main focus is still on introducing this. All right, right. Okay, the main focus is on history. Now, let's look at what option A says. It suggests that this article is most likely to appear in a publication for historians who study the history of the human world. But as we just saw, it shouldn't be about studying human events, right? It should be about studying animals, plants, and all kinds of flora and fauna, not humans. We're not talking about things like the Qin, Han, or Three Kingdoms periods. Those aren't our research subjects. We're not historians, we're biologists. So option A isn't what we're looking for. All right, now let's move on to option B, which says this is an overview of 19th century history. A book used in biological research seems to fit. Okay, because indeed we are talking about the research methods of the author. Okay, so let's look at option C, which says something like this would be included in a seminar paper, right, on the development of embryogenesis as a field of study in 19th century biology. Using the term embryogenesis, which means the formation of embryos, makes sense as a research topic. Okay, so for an article with embryogenesis as its research topic, in this one, embryogenesis is only mentioned in a single sentence, and none of the other sentences talk about it. So it's not even the main topic of the article. Could it be published in a journal about embryogenesis, right? So actually, we can eliminate that option. Now, let's look at the part of the option that says it should be included in a book review. This book is called The Development of Fossils in the 19th Century. What does this have to do with fossils? Throughout the entire article, we never even thought about fossils. So why did they suddenly appear out of nowhere? Okay, so let's move on to option E. What does it say? It says this is a lecture And the topic of the lecture is the limitations of using experimental methods in modern biological research. But in our article, the emphasis was never on experiments. What we were emphasizing was historical interpretation, right? So what's the point of placing it in a lecture about experiments? That's why, in the end, it's likely to be option B. All right, we've talked for an hour and finally finished discussing this article. This is why I said we could really only cover one article today, because I know that with this article, although it doesn't have a lot of text and the language isn't particularly difficult, and there aren't that many questions either, but it really is difficult as a high-level advanced question from the high score section. What I want you to see is not just whether you got it right or wrong. If that were the case, you could just look at the answer explanations yourself. What I want you to see, it's also not simply about what the story in the article is about. If that were all, you could just ask AI. What I want you to see is to identify the errors in your thinking and to compare your thought process with mine. During your exam preparation, what issues do you encounter? And then how can you connect these issues to the ways you usually work on improving yourself? It's all interconnected. This is just like how I've been developing this diagnostic system and also continuously working on the logic behind this exam preparation support system. You can't just know that you got something wrong, and you can't just know why you got it wrong. You also need to connect the reason for your mistake back to yourself. What abilities are you lacking? And in what ways can you strengthen those abilities? That's the idea. All right. I hope you gain a lot from every one of my seminars. Well, I'm already pretty exhausted from today's talk, so I hope we'll meet again next time.